Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Our topic today is fascinating, and that is the incredibly diverse and surprising world of fungi. Most of us, when we think of fungi, we think of mushrooms. But mushrooms are actually just a kind of fruit produced by fungi to help with reproduction. I will tell you about mushrooms. But there is so much more to this topic. Fungi can be microscopic or enormous. They can grow in extreme environments on Earth, like deserts, or in deep sea sediments. Some can even survive the intense cosmic and UV radiation encountered in space. They can also form symbiotic bonds, mutually beneficial relationships with certain species of plants and animals. As many of you probably know, fungi biologically do not fit into the kingdom of plants or animals. We will learn why that is and what distinguishes fungi from these groupings. There is so much to discover, as you will see. But first, I'd like to take 1 minute of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly contribute to our work financially. If you join, you will get various new things, like the possibility to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and regular bonus episodes. We already have 4 episodes available only to our Patreons, with the latest one being about the Library of Alexandria. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will have your say on the choices of topics. This topic was selected by our Patreons. We have advance releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find a link in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Feel your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched, and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, off we go. Before we discuss biology and definitions, I told you that the diversity of sizes could be extreme. Do you know that the most massive living organism on Earth could well be a fungus? In the pine forests of northeastern Oregon, in the Malheur National Forest, grows a species of fungus quite common to the western United States, Armillaria ostiae. But in this particular location, a giant specimen was identified, living mostly underground. A study of the specimen revealed that it is in fact several thousand years old and estimated to cover 3.5 square miles, which is about 9 square kilometers, for a total weight of approximately 30,000 tons, or just over 6,600 pounds. For comparison, the largest living animal on Earth is the blue whale, which can reach up to 200 tons. So this common fungus weighs as much as the weight of 150 adult blue whales for this single specimen of fungus. And yet, you could walk in the forest and never really see it. What is visible at the surface is its roots, the mushrooms that pop up in the autumn. But as we now know, these are just the tips of the iceberg. It is believed that this fungus was able to reach such an impressive size thanks to the favorable climate and low competition for land and nutrients. This particular species of fungus feeds by invading trees, growing under their bark. It stops water from circulating in the tree, which kills it very slowly, over about 30 or 40 years. And as it feeds on the tree's wood, forming a white membrane under the bark that resembles latex, but it is a living organism. Even though it is spread out over such a vast area, we know that it is the same continuous fungus. We know this because in different places the tissues are connected, and DNA tests have revealed that samples taken several kilometers apart are from the same organism. While it continues to grow underground, at the surface it makes mushrooms or feeds on trunks. To be clear, not all fungi are dangerous to trees. Many are even necessary for trees to live and to extract nutrients from the soil, as we will discuss later. Large fungi first appeared several 100 million years ago, during the Ordovician and Devonian periods, approximately 470 to 360 million years ago, and were the largest land-dwelling organisms at the time, at least that we know of. These ancient fungi were mushrooms of sorts that resembled tree trunks. They were about 3 feet wide and up to 26 feet, or 8 meters in height. We know about them through terrestrial fossils, and the study of these fossilized tissues suggests that they were part of the fungus kingdom, even though their exact relationship with existing fungi lineages today is uncertain. So this raises a question: what are fungi exactly? Historically, we had 2 man-made categories, animal and plant. These categories were based on mere observation, meant to easily distinguish one from another. So what is a plant, and what is an animal? The traditional historical definition of plants, as opposed to animals, was made in antiquity. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, distinguished plants as things that generally do not move, versus animals that are generally mobile to catch their food. This distinction, these categories, persisted well into modern times. So, if historically the plant kingdom was defined by default as all living things that were not animals, this also included all fungi and algae. But it appeared that, in some cases, things were, in fact, more ambiguous. In the modern period, When an effort was made to better define these categories based on scientific evidence and criteria, it appeared that we were to more precisely define plants by common structural characteristics, including on a cellular level, not just based on visual observation. Then fungi and some other organisms, like different types of algae, could not be considered part of the same kingdom as plants. The basis for our modern system of scientific understanding and classification of species has its roots in the work of 18th century Swedish botanist and zoologist Carl Linnaeus. He formalized the two ancient categories, naming them Vegetabilia and Animalia, again based purely on visual observation. But then in the 19th century came a boom of discovery, and countless species were observed or described, aided by new instruments like microscopes and eventually DNA. More in-depth scientific investigation revealed that it was not as simple as plants versus animals. Many other organisms, species both large and small, did not fit into the plant and animal categories, as defined by Carl Linnaeus. For example, sponges, but there are many examples. Externally, sponges, which are found in the ocean, look a lot like plants. They don't move to catch food. They don't even have a nervous, digestive, or circulatory system. But unlike plants, sponges filter their food from the water they live in. And on a cellular level, they are closer to animals, not plants. So, though they were considered once plants, today they are classified as animals. Sponges could be classified as animals, but there are other organisms that are too different from the plant and animal kingdoms to be classified in either of the two. This is why new kingdoms were established. Fungi was one of these new kingdoms, but not the only one. And these classifications could still change in the future as we continue to broaden our understanding of the natural world. But as of today, the mainstream classification of living organisms begins with the distinction between two big families of species, based on the structure of their cells: Prokaryotes and Eukaryotes. Prokaryotes include bacteria and archaea, two kinds of single-cell organisms. In the history of evolution, it is believed that prokaryotes appeared first and eukaryotes later in several stages. A big difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. And it is not always the case, but eukaryotes can have several cells. All prokaryotes, on the other hand, are single-cell organisms, whereas eukaryotes have the capacity to form larger bodies when an individual multiplies its cells. Eukaryotes are grouped into several branches. Plants are one of them, and so are animals and fungi. And there is an additional non-classified group called the Protista that serves as a catch-all for all species that cannot be put into any of the three other groups. This is why I mentioned that this classification may evolve yet again in the future. A catch-all category is useful, but does not represent a full understanding of the different branches of living things. The domain Protista includes thousands of species, even microscopic, like many amoebas, but not all of them are tiny. For example, giant brown algae seaweeds, also known as kelp, could be mistaken for an aquatic plant, but they are not. They are protista organisms that are very distinct from plants on a cellular level. So, up to this point, the kingdom of plants has been redefined from everything that wasn't animal centuries ago to, more accurately, eukaryotes that predominantly practice photosynthesis, meaning they produce their food and organic material using the energy of sunlight. Even in this narrower category, this still includes tens of thousands of species, including land plants and green algae. The animal kingdom includes organisms that, with a few exceptions, consume organic material, breathe oxygen, and are able to move, at least during a stage of their life. Many marine animals only move at an early stage, and then they stay put. And they can also reproduce sexually. There are approximately 1.5 million described animal species, with an estimated total of 7 million currently existing animal species. The fungi kingdom is separate because, unlike plants, fungi do not photosynthesize. They instead acquire food by absorbing molecules from their environment, typically by secreting digestive enzymes. The fact that they digest food coming from outside could make them animals, but they are not animals due to their lack of mobility. A fungus's only way of moving is by growing, except for the spores they disseminate. The spores themselves are not fungi. They just carry genetic information as means of reproduction. We will see later that fungi that produce mushrooms, the mushrooms are a means of disseminating their spores. There are many other differences between fungi and animals. Animals are generally able to respond quickly to external stimuli, as they have nerves, muscles, or tissue that can contract. Fungi lack these characteristics, and their only way to move in the environment is by changing their direction of growth, or their metabolism, which is significantly slower than a nervous or a muscular reaction. And yet, another difference is that fungi also do not digest food in a stomach. They don't have one. And finally, the cells of a fungus are different, with cell walls that contain chitin, a complex molecule produced by many organisms. Chitin forms rigid surfaces, and it is present also in the exoskeletons of insects and crustaceans. It is the main component of their external armor. Chitin, in its properties and function, is closest to the protein keratin found in animals. Keratin, a protein, is naturally produced by many animal species, including humans, and is the main component of nails, hair, feathers, scales, and even horns. Keratin is a different molecule than chitin, a different polymer, but the two function very similarly. So, fungi have chitin in their cell walls, making them rigid, and this is a major biological difference they have from plants and animals. So, now that we have seen what differentiates fungi from other kingdoms and why fungi are considered their own kingdom, let's explore the different forms they can take and human interactions with certain types of fungi, which is a good moment to tell you about yeasts and molds. Not that humans have a good understanding of the fungi kingdom. It is incredibly diverse and is a continent that remains largely unexplored by us. Fungi include 2 to 4 million species, but only the most visible terrestrial ones are known, about 150,000 species. This means that less than 10% of species in this kingdom have been described scientifically. The branch of biology that studies fungi is called mycology, a term that emerged in the 19th century. Besides mycologists, most humans primarily interact with fungi as a source of food. Widespread use of fungi by humans since ancient times, and, apart from directly consuming mushrooms, humans used yeast, a type of fungus, for bread making and fermentation. So what is yeast, or more precisely, what are yeasts? As there are many types, we currently know of 1,500 described yeast species. But how do we know that these are fungi if they are single-celled? Well, as we have seen before, first, because their cells have a nucleus, and this makes them eukaryotes. And then there is chitin in their cell walls, and this is typically a fungi. Yeasts are unicellular, but it is believed they evolved from multicellular ancestors. And a particularity of some yeast species is that they can assemble and develop multicellular characteristics, forming strings of connected cells like a colony or a community, and many individuals staying together. They are fungi, so their way of feeding is by secreting enzymes around them. The enzyme is a molecule that accelerates chemical reactions, and so it acts as a catalyst to rearrange surrounding molecules into material that the yeast can absorb. This is the mechanism that makes yeast useful for fermentation. There is one yeast species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, better known as baker's yeast or brewer's yeast, that converts carbohydrates, also known as sugars, into carbon dioxide and alcohol. Carbon dioxide and alcohol are byproducts, waste from its feeding cycle. These byproducts are what interest us humans. Carbon dioxide is released as gas and forms tiny bubbles inside a dough or batter. And in the case of fermented drinks like wine or beer, the yeast produces alcohol and the bubbles in the beer. The mechanism of yeast fermentation remained unknown until microbiology explained it. But early humans learned to cultivate yeast, for example, by making and maintaining a sourdough starter, or to make alcohol with grains and fruits, even though they didn't really know or understand how any of it worked. These are ancient processes. When it comes to yeast rice bread, there are drawings depicting the bread-making process found in Egypt dating back 4,000 years. But the practice appeared long before that. Vessels as old as the Egyptian drawings and that once contained alcohol have been found in Israel. They were used to contain fermented beverages like beer and mead, and by studying their interior surfaces microscopically, they reveal that the yeast colonies these vessels originally contained had survived thousands of years, despite the absence of additional food. They had simply slowed down their metabolism, waiting for better days when they could once again be fed. This is the earliest direct biological evidence of yeast use in ancient cultures. It took a long time for scientists to understand the mechanism that made yeast active. Until the works of Louis Pasteur in 1857, yeast was believed to be a simple chemical catalyst rather than a living organism. Advancements in microbiology in the second half of the 19th century helped us to understand how yeast worked. And since then, yeast's reproductive cycle has also been explored. Yeast can reproduce sexually in rare cases, but most of the time does so asexually. Some yeasts can fission, that is to say, the yeast cell splits itself into two identical daughter cells. Or the more common method of asexual reproduction, though, is by budding. This means that a small daughter cell, a bud without a nucleus, forms on an existing yeast cell. The parent cell's nucleus then splits, with half migrating into the daughter cell. The bud cell continues to grow, stuck to its mother cell until eventually it reaches maturity and separates as a new cell. When it comes to human consumption, yeasts are almost always safe. They cannot harm us, but there are a small number of yeasts that can be opportunistic pathogens and can cause fungal infections. They are considered opportunistic because these infections are relatively rare, affecting almost exclusively individuals with compromised immune systems. Contribution of yeasts to our daily lives is not 100% positive. Yeast can help produce food and enhance its texture or taste, but under the right conditions can also spoil it. If yeast is present in food that contains sugars or other carbon sources that can be metabolized, combined with the right conditions of temperature and acidity. Yeasts like environments with low pH, 5 or lower, and in these conditions they can proliferate and maintain active fermentation. Other organisms, such as certain bacteria, can spoil food and be actually dangerous to consume, but yeasts can instead alter the taste and texture of foods to the point of making them unsuitable for consumption. When this happens, the growth of yeast within food products often appears on their surface, such as in cheeses and meats, or an older jar of jam that has been opened for too long. The overgrowth appears as what we in everyday language call mold. So, what is mold? Mold is not a type of fungus. It is a structure, rather, one of the structures that certain fungi can form. Yeasts, when they proliferate, can become visible and more familiarly be called mold. But biologically, this is not what they are. The actual mold, the structure, owes its appearance, which is dust-like, with different colors, to the formation of spores. Yeasts reproduce essentially asexually, as we just said, by budding or fission. So they wouldn't produce a mat of spores. But other fungi do. Fungi that are much more complex, multicellular, and bigger. To understand why, we need to talk about their bodies, their structure. In most multicellular fungi, the organism takes the shape of long, branching filaments. They grow by expanding this structure, which can then interact with the environment. This is a fungi's permanent body. Mushrooms are just temporary fruits. The spores that sometimes become visible, because there are many, are vehicles for reproduction. These spores are not the fungi themselves. These filaments are called hyphae. The plural is hyphae, and each hypha is microscopic. They become visible to the naked eye only when there are many, and they are woven together, forming cords. Each hypha is like a long chain of cells. The structure is a few cells in diameter, and this is where the chitin in the cell walls is useful. Its rigidity gives the structure its shape, a filament, which is flexible but holds together. Without chitin, it would be completely soft. Hyphae grow from their tips. New cells are added. This is how the filaments expand. There is no nervous system in a fungus, but through mechanisms that are not yet fully understood, the direction of fungal growth can be affected by the environment. For example, it has been observed that the application of an electric field could modify their development. And somehow, hyphae can also can detect reproductive units, even from a distance, and grow towards them to establish contact. There is also a degree of coordination in the growth of different hyphae from the same organism. The filaments can weave through a permeable surface to penetrate it, for example. The filaments by themselves have no muscles and cannot move. Their growth is not random, but responds to external stimuli. So these filaments, the hyphae, are the basic structure of most multicellular fungi and are the way the organism grows. Collectively, all these tiny threads form a root structure called mycelium. So while hyphae are generally transparent, when they cluster together to form mycelium, they appear like very fine, fluffy white threads. But molds are not like that. They look generally dust-like and can have different colors. Why? Because of the spores. Molds become obvious and take their familiar appearance on food or on a wall or other surfaces because at the end of the hyphae's filament, spores proliferate, and this is what produces the dusty texture and also makes various molds a health hazard in case of allergies or when the spores float free and cause disease. What are spores, by the way? They look like a kind of fine dust and are produced by different fungi or plants like ferns, for example. But let's take a closer look at spores. In biology, a spore is a unit of sexual or asexual reproduction made for dispersal. In terms of function, they are like the seeds of flowering plants, but with different mechanisms. Seeds have been fertilized and are already an embryo of a plant enclosed in a protective covering. On Earth, spores appeared long before seeds and are, in fact, the step before seeds, not only in evolutionary terms, but also in the fertilization process. Flowering plants also produce spores. Pollen is a spore. But pollination is a form of sexual reproduction. It mixes the genetic input of two individuals. Some plants can self-pollinate, but still, the embryo will be the product of two halves of genetic information. Some spores utilize sexual reproduction, but others are self-sufficient. Under the right conditions, a spore can start dividing itself and grow into a new organism, which will be a clone of the organism that produced it. Each individual spore, though, has little chance of fertilizing another or of growing into its own organism. But plants and fungi that reproduce using spores compensate with quantity. with an abundance of spores so small they look like dust. Another way they compensate is with longevity. Spores are adapted for survival, with some even lasting thousands of years. This means that a spore might still become a new specimen centuries after the death of the organism that created it. So returning to molds, they are fluffy and have a dust-like aspect. And their colors, too, are due to this mat of spores that appear at the end of the hyphae. Molds tend to have a bad reputation in domestic life, and for a good reason. They can be dangerous. On walls, they are usually an indication that humidity is excessive and that there is a lack of ventilation or cleaning. Molds can also spoil foods. But molds, or more precisely, the fungi behind them, are vital. Why? Because they are responsible for a good portion of biodegradation, which is necessary for ecosystems to thrive and to recycle organic material. Land vegetation, especially forests, would be very different without fungi living in the ground, and to a lesser extent on trees, constantly breaking down and recombining molecules. Molds are also useful in the production of pharmaceuticals. For example, mold gave us antibiotics, which were a game changer for modern medicine. Molds are also essential to the production of various pigments, foods, and beverages. The chemical and pharmaceutical industries harvest enzymes from molds to use in production. So now we understand that mold is the dusty spores produced at the ends of mycelium, these clusters of hyphae. But as I've also mentioned, others bear fruit instead of spores, fruits better known as mushrooms or toadstools. There is so much to say about mushrooms, which are also important to humans as a source of food, of medicine, and more anecdotally, of psychoactive substances. One surprising thing about mushrooms is how fast they can grow. They sometimes seem to appear overnight, which literally they do, though their inception began before they ever appeared. I already mentioned that the structure, the body of a multicellular fungus, the mycelium, was made of hyphae, these thin threads or filaments in the ground, or on dead matter like a tree trunk. The hyphae form cords called mycelial cords that look similar to plant roots, and actually they have a similar function. They can carry nutrients over a long distance. In some cases, as we will discuss later, fungi that act as parasites also use these cords to spread their infestation by growing from established clusters to uninfected parts, like tree roots. Mycelial cords can sometimes be very strong. It's not common, but some species are able to slowly penetrate masonry with their cords of aggregated hyphae. Now, when the season is right, and they have accumulated enough nutrients, some fungi will produce mushrooms as a way of disseminating their spores. Within the mycelium develops a small nodule, no bigger than a pinhead. This pinhead is just made of interwoven hyphae, and it expands into a roundish structure that looks a bit like a very small egg, preparing for the arrival of the mushroom. This little structure is called a button. Inside the button, there is intense activity as the mushroom is forming. Sometimes it's surrounded by a veil of mycelium that protects it. As the egg expands, the veil ruptures, and depending on the species, it may remain as a sort of cup at the base of the mushroom stem, if there is one, or as patches on the cap. It is also the remains of this veil that may form a sort of ring around the center of the stem once the mushroom has popped up. When the mushroom is ready in its button, the time needed varies. Typically, it takes about a week. The mushroom can grow very rapidly by just absorbing water provided by the mycelium. All the cells are preformed, and they suddenly inflate as the mycelium injects water carried through its web of filaments. This is how mushrooms pop up seemingly overnight. The button is already formed. It only needs water. But this is also why mushrooms are short-lived and fragile. They are mainly water contained by membranes. Typically, spores are placed under the mushroom's cap, where they can be dispersed by wind or rain, which would have been nearly impossible for an underground fungus. But as you've likely seen yourself, mushrooms can be colorful, sometimes even spectacular, and have intriguing shapes. Why should a fungus spend its energy and precious resources on a mushroom that is here to distribute spores and will exist only for a short time? This is believed to be an evolutionary feature. Bright colors and plump fruit attract animals that feed on the mushrooms, thus helping to disperse spores and help with reproduction. It's very similar to how flowers use colors, scents, and shapes to attract insects and other pollinators that will carry their pollen to another flower of the same species. These organisms offer food to animals, and the animals help them to reproduce. Now, as you know, the bright colors of mushrooms can also be a warning sign. Mankind has used mushrooms as a source of food since ancient times. But one thing humans learned early is that you have to be selective when choosing mushrooms to ingest. Many species are edible, the majority actually, but it's always advisable to cook them before eating because heat destroys several potentially poisonous compounds. There is a small number of deadly species and several others that can cause severe symptoms in humans. It is supposed that the concentration of toxic compounds in mushrooms could also be an evolutionary feature selected for some species of fungi. When the mycelium forms a mushroom, it spends considerable energy and material to produce it. There would be a risk that animals would eat it while it's still a button before the mushroom expands and becomes able to disperse spores. Making it poisonous is either a defense mechanism or a way of making the consumer vomit before digestion, so the spores are not lost. Among the toxic compounds found in dangerous mushrooms, a recurring one is amatoxin, which is lethal even in small doses, even as little as half a mushroom. Amatoxins cause damage to cells once they enter someone's system. They perforate the membranes of cells, and since they travel through the bloodstream, are able to easily reach organs in the body. Even a small quantity of amatoxin is enough to damage the liver and heart beyond repair. So, if you go mushroom hunting and are unsure about a mushroom, it is always better to be on the safe side. Most of the time, poisonous mushrooms do not kill, but they can still cause a lot of damage. Wild mushrooms must always be cooked before eating. Never eat them raw. Another more long-term danger presented by mushrooms is that they have a propensity to absorb heavy metals like lead or mercury, including radioactive elements. This is not an issue for mushrooms bought in a supermarket and grown in a controlled environment. However, it can be a problem when regularly consuming wild mushrooms. Other types of compounds found in mushrooms are considerably less sinister and have actually been sought after in various native medicine traditions for their real or supposed healing properties. These are an informal group known as psilocybin mushrooms, better known as magic mushrooms or simply shrooms. They are sought after for their psychedelic properties. It seems they were discovered in various parts of the world during the Stone Age. Appropriate. There is evidence of this in Africa and Europe, but they were particularly present in the Americas, North, Central, and South, and were used in religious, spiritual, or divinatory contexts in indigenous cultures, where their use sometimes continues. But why do magic mushrooms have psychedelic effects? It's because of the psilocybin they contain, a compound that, when ingested, is broken down by the liver. This is why the effect is not immediate and takes about 20 to 30 minutes. The resulting compound, Psilocin, is responsible for the mushroom's psychoactive effects. It activates the same receptors in the brain that serotonin activates. Serotonin is a complex module, a neurotransmitter that plays a crucial role in regulating various functions, including mood modulation, cognition, reward, learning, or memory. It also regulates physiological processes such as vomiting or vasoconstriction, which is a narrowing of blood vessels. The exact way serotonin works in our bodies is not entirely understood, but what matters here is that the psilocin binds to and activates neurotransmitter receptors that are usually activated by serotonin, which is completely unusual for our brains. This activation by psilocin produces the characteristic trip, including changes in mood, imagination, and perception, and often including hallucinations, which seem to come out of nowhere since they are not induced by external stimuli. The way this substance works probably also explains why the experience can be very different from one person to the next. The experience results from the interaction of the molecule with someone's centers of perception, memory, and thought processes, which are very personal things. In a study conducted by Johns Hopkins Hospital among a population of people who had consumed magic mushrooms, a third of them declared it had been the single most significant spiritual event in their lives. Yet another third reported extreme anxiety caused by the experience. So it is not a benign or risk-free experience. The use of mushrooms in many countries around the world is illegal, along with other drugs, because that is what they are. As I mentioned earlier, fungi are also vital for trees. Sometimes they kill trees and consume them, but sometimes they form an essential partnership with plants. Tree roots in and of themselves are not very good at absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. In order for trees to reach their large size, they depend on symbiotic association with a group of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi. This relationship is less complicated than it may sound. The mycorrhizal fungi are located inside and around the roots of plants and trees. There are several thousand different species of fungi that participate in this kind of partnership, colonizing the root tissues of many different kinds of plants. Some of these fungi can only associate with one genus of plant, while others are generalists and can bond with different plants. The plants that benefit from this association include eucalyptus, birch, oak, different roses, pine, orchids, and many others. It is called symbiotic relationship because each side brings something to the other. The plants need to extract nutrients from the soil, which they cannot absorb well through the cell walls of their roots, and this is where the fungus can help. It injects the nutrients, minerals, and water that the plant needs, additionally serving as a barrier against toxic elements. For example, it has been observed that trees can survive in contaminated or acidic soils, rich in metals, thanks to the fungi living in their roots. On the other hand, the plants feed the fungi. Fungi cannot synthesize sugar like plants can through photosynthesis. So as a reward for its services, the fungus is given food and shelter in the roots of the tree. For the tree, the fungus is like an extension of its roots. This symbiosis was observed as far back as the 19th century, but a more recent discovery is that trees can somehow exchange signals using a form of communication that is not well understood yet. This communication appears to be facilitated by the contacts between the tree's roots, and it seems that fungi also play a role here. Mycelium, the web made of filaments of hyphae, can transport molecules very well, and so signals may be traveling between trees or plants via these molecules themselves or their flow. Fossil records indicate that this association between fungi and plants is ancient, thousands of millions of years, but it is not known precisely when it began. In the current state of paleomycology, the study of fossil fungi, it is believed fungi diverged from other life forms around 1.5 billion years ago, at a time when, to our knowledge, only single-cell forms of life existed. The first fungi very likely remained single-celled for hundreds of millions of years. They would have evolved from a bacteria ancestor, and for a long time would have stayed purely aquatic. The oldest and most disputed fossils of terrestrial fungi date back to about 400 million years ago, the time period called Ordovician, known to be a moment when life forms suddenly became more diverse and complex. When I say suddenly, of course, I mean so on a geological scale, over a period of several million years. But it could have been before this time, during the Cambrian era, that fungi colonized the Earth. The Cambrian was another period of rapid life expansion or radiation. It could have even happened before the Cambrian. A doubt exists because fossils that look a lot like fungi have been dated as early as 635 million years ago. but it is unclear whether they were already terrestrial fungi or something else. Due to their structure and composition, fungi do not fossilize well. They cannot biomineralize, that is to say, their cellular structure cannot be replaced by minerals and become rock. Biomineralization is a phenomenon that yields the best fossils, so the fossil record for fungi is relatively small and contains prints rather than three-dimensional single-cell fungi. So it doesn't help much to study their ancient forms. Fossil records become better later when fungi grew and formed mycelium. In any case, fungi adapted very well to land life and grew to impressive sizes during the Devonian. As I mentioned earlier, they could form structures comparable to trees in size. This makes specialists believe that they dominated the land before photosynthetic plants did, or at least were already one of the dominant life forms when plants colonized the land. It is hard to imagine that fungi could have thrived alone on the land, if only because the constant of their nature is that they cannot produce their own food. They live on existing organic matter. So somehow fungi had to follow plants on the continents rather than precede them. But they could have lived in wet soils on the Earth's continents long before land animals arrived. And interestingly, because they only need food to survive and bearable conditions of temperature and humidity, it has been observed that fungi did not collapse with other forms of life during extinction events. They could even have thrived during some of them. For example, it has been observed that the evidence of fossilized fungi suddenly increased approximately 66 million years ago during the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. This was the mass extinction event that killed off most dinosaurs and many other species. One possible explanation is that this mass extinction could have turned Earth into a massive compost pile. With all this organic matter available and no predators to control the population of fungi, they would have thrived. So, for a period of time, maybe a few thousand years, fungi would have flourished while countless species of animals and plants disappeared. I already talked about symbiotic relationship between plants and fungi, but fungi are also known to partner with insects. Several groups of ants and termites cultivate fungi, and they do so for several purposes: as a food source and also as a structural component of their nests. There are also insects like wood wasps and at least one species of stingless bees that have included fungi in their reproductive cycle. When they lay eggs or leave larvae behind, they leave them with a stash of spores or developed fungi. The fungi provide food to the larvae, but will not be entirely consumed. So, on the one hand, it helps the insects to reproduce successfully, and on the other hand, this association disseminates the fungi or their spores to new locations. Yet another form of association is with algae and fungus, which forms lichen, found almost anywhere on Earth. In a variety of colors and shapes, lichen could be mistaken for plants, but they are not. They are composite organisms in which algae or bacteria live in a mutualistic relationship with fungi, forming what could be seen as tiny self-contained ecosystem. They produce their own food through photosynthesis, and the fungi provide a protective structure, a medium, where their tiny single-cell hosts can live and multiply. And lichens have no roots, which is why they can grow on almost any surface. They just need air and light. When lichens grow on trees, they are not parasites. They use the trunk as a surface, a substrate. Or sometimes in rainforests or temperate woodlands, they hang from branches. There are other cases, though, where the relationship with fungi is not mutualistic, but rather parasitic, wherein the fungi feed on the host organism. For agriculture, the most devastating of them is a species called the rice blast fungus. It is a plague affecting the cultivation of rice and can also attack other grains. It is estimated that it destroys enough rice every year to feed 60 million people. There are also carnivorous fungi that capture tiny worms, nematodes. Of course, the fungi cannot actively hunt them because fungi are immobile. Instead, they use a kind of passive hunting technique, forming constricting rings or sticky nets with their hyphae that makes the nematode unable to move, after which they digest it with enzymes. Fungi can also be parasites to other fungi. Among the tens of thousands of known species, a large variety of survival strategies exist. Fungi can go so far as to become parasites to insects, eating them from the inside, turning the insects into zombies controlled by their hyphae that grow inside the animal. This is fairly rare and does not last very long because eventually the host will die and decompose. It sounds and looks rather sinister, but it is a brilliant survival strategy to feed and gain mobility at the same time. There are so many more things I could say about fungi. Like mycologists, we've just really scratched the surface of the fungi kingdom. And, as with all my stories, this was intended only as an introduction that hopefully piqued your curiosity and encouraged you to learn more about our fascinating world. And now, you can let go and fall asleep if you wish to. Or you can always pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.